Hi, I'm Damon Pohl. Welcome back to the Versus series. Today we will be diving into stories filled with dungeons and adventure. There will be discussions of fantasy violence, weapons, and combat, but for the most part, these comics have a light and comedic tone. It will be a nice break from the horrors of our last episode. Please support your local authors and publishers, and request these comics if they aren't available in your area. Without further ado, let's continue with our comic cultivating curriculum. Dungeon Meshi vs. Ozanari Dungeon. Part 1. The Overview. The comics we'll look at today draw inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons. As I mentioned in one of my shorter videos, Dungeons & Dragons was released in 1974. It codified standard aspects of fantasy media by establishing a structure and a set of rules for creating adventure stories. The famous role-playing game provides a system for character creation, leveling, and skill progression. Pre-made adventure guides and lore books help new dungeon masters jumpstart their fantasy designs. D&D stories have long been popular in comic form, like DC's Dragonlance or Forgotten Realms, both released in the late 80s. In the 2020s, tabletop RPGs have had a resurgence, with the rise of many popular podcasts, live plays, and TV shows. The authors we'll look at today borrow and twist RPG themes to create exciting stories in vivid fantasy settings. First, we'll take a bite into the tasty tale of Dungeon Meshi. Dungeon Meshi, or Delicious in Dungeon, is a fantasy adventure manga created by Ryoko Kui. It was published in 2014 by Enterbrain and later in English by Yen Press. An anime adaptation began airing earlier this year. Prior to Dungeon Meshi, Kui worked on short stories and a webcomic. Their 2011 collection, Terrarium in Drawer, featured fantastical and visually detailed stories and won an award for excellence at the Japan Media Arts Festival in 2014. Shortly thereafter, Kui created a serialized comic with a culinary quirk. At first, Dungeon Meshi appears to be an explainer manga. It shows off complex dishes through the lens of fantasy adventure. The story provides detailed recipes, complete with instructions and nutritional information. Kui frequently uses RPG stat polygons, also known as radar or spider graphs, to illustrate the strengths and weaknesses of the dishes. This realistic and thorough analysis of dungeon cuisine brings life to the comic through its environment. As the series progresses, the story takes a turn into high fantasy. It has deep lore, genuine characters, and compelling hooks. While eating is a through-line theme, and recipes are still present from time to time, the story picks up as the characters explore the mysteries of the dungeon. As we learn about the setting, the motivations and history of the characters is slowly revealed. Here is the description from Meshi's first printed volume. When young adventurer Louse and his company are attacked and soundly thrashed by a dragon deep in a dungeon, the party loses all its money and provisions, and a member. They're eager to go back and save her, but there is just one problem. If they set out with no food or coin to speak of, they're sure to starve on the way. But Louse comes up with a brilliant idea. Let's eat the monsters. Slimes, basilisks, and even dragons. None are safe from the appetites of these dungeon-crawling gourmands. Meshi plays with the idea of hunger and desire, and the dungeon master's ability to shape the world as they see fit. The story and characters of Meshi feel fresh. Familiar Dungeons & Dragons enemies being turned into food makes for enjoyable reading, although it might make you hungry. Recipes include dishes like candied mandrake or roast basilisk. The party spends quality time breaking bread and resting together. As they feast, they become familiar with each other's dietary needs and personal preferences. Food and fantasy go well together, like the many mesmerizing meals imagined by Miyazaki, or the bright world of Battle Chef Brigade, a game featured in one of my shorter videos. Dungeon Meshi literally means dungeon meal, and it is a fitting title for the story's content. The localized name, Delicious in Dungeon, hints at its inclusion of food and recipes, and allows the comic to share the abbreviation D&D. While I love the localized name, due to there being more than 100 instances of the word dungeon in this essay, I will be referring to the series as Meshi moving forward. Now let's digest our meal and jump into the vast world of Ozanari Dungeon. Ozanari Dungeon is a fantasy adventure manga created by Moto Koyama. It was first published by Monthly Comic Nora in 1987. Koyama is a dedicated artist with over 20 manga across many genres. There are comics like the comedic Final Coffee Break, as well as shonen and seinen stories. Koyama even dabbled with mecha, working on 2 Gundam series in 1988 and 1990. Ozanari Dungeon is Koyama's longest serialized work and is in the sword and sorcery genre. Sword and sorcery commonly showcases warriors like Xena or She-Ra, characters who resemble Ozanari Dungeon's protagonist, Mocha. Ozanari Dungeon was adapted into a 3-episode OVA, or original video animation, in 1991. Here is the description from the OVA release. Mocha, Blueman, and Killiman are a motley crew of mercenaries who work odd jobs for the guild. While on the lookout for new employment, they come across an old man named Foron, who hires them to find the legendary artifact, Dragon's Head. Unknown to Mocha and the gang, Foron works for the evil king, Gazel, who desires the ultimate power of the Dragon's Head at any cost. Now, to keep the artifact safe from evil's hands, they must travel to all of the ancient elemental temples. And no temple is complete without treasures, danger, and of course, monsters. The word Ozanari can be translated as careless or commonplace, or even perfunctory. But I think the meaning that best fits the series is slapdash. The party tends to dive in head first, and they quickly roll through many grand settings and encounters. Each member of the trio is named after a type of coffee. There is mocha, as in the chocolatey mochaccino. Blueman is named for Blue Mountain Coffee, a Jamaican brand that became popular in Japan in the 1950s and is still popular today, according to a 2023 article by Heyman Coffee. Killiman is named after Kilimanjaro Coffee, a Japanese branding name for all coffee beans produced in Tanzania. Later in the series, another character is introduced whose name is inspired by espresso. This playful naming reminds me of the Spice Boys and other puns in Toriyama's Dragon Ball. Ozanari's adventuring party is well balanced. Killiman shows off powerful magic when they feel like it. Blueman helps with sleuthing, thieving, and combat. Both follow Mocha because they believe in her bravery and heart, and she always returns to rescue them in a pinch. There have been several additional Ozanari stories released over Koyama's long career, including a sequel and a prequel that we will discuss later on. Now that we've gotten to know our party members, let's dive into an adventure. This is the final spoiler warning, as I will now discuss specific aspects of the characters and plot of both series. Part 2. The Similarities. It turns out I am not the first to suggest these comics pair well together. During my research, I was pleased to find that back in 2015, Shiro Miwa posted fan art of the 2 parties sharing a meal, titled Ozanari Dungeon Meshi. Both series use the word dungeon in their titles and include grand adventures through sprawling labyrinths as a focal point. The depths of the dungeons are a vivid setting for the stories to thrive. In both series, there are not only dungeons, but dungeon masters, who rule and manipulate the monsters and layout of the dungeons. They are responsible for the traps and treasures that the locations have to offer. Defeating and usurping a DM is part of how Ozanari's first volume starts, as the trio helps a displaced DM reclaim their dungeon. Dungeon masters are a theme that make a regular occurrence in Dungeon Meshi. Controlling the dungeon would allow the power and agency to fulfill one's greatest desires. Both comics borrow from D&D elements and are clearly influenced by the gamification of fantasy. There are familiar ideas like classes, skills, magic, and enchanted equipment. Both stories feature groups of adventurers making their way through the dungeons. They combat traps and enemies as well as their own endurance. The characters encounter creatures like orcs, lizard folk, and chimera, all straight out of the D&D Monster Compendium. Additionally, these comics feature common fantasy races like elves, dwarves, and halflings. These are a familiar jumping-off point for fans of Tolkien and fantasy tabletop games. There are also anthropomorphic animal races, characters resembling humanoid cats and dogs. These creatures are sometimes called kobolds or beast folk. The D&D setting Forgotten Realms has a race of cat people known as Tabaxi. In Ozanari Dungeon, the beast folk races are named after Inu and Neko, Japanese words for dogs and cats respectively. The stories feature many different races living together in harmony and strengthening their bonds. There is a real synergy from the characters' different classes and attributes, as there should be with any D&D party. These stories feature powerful mages. Meshi's Marcel is adept with fire magic and can use both elvish and gnomish spells. She is a valuable and skilled member of the guild, and she grows as a character throughout the series. In Ozanari, despite his casual demeanor, Killiman shows off remarkable magic when it is needed. D&D players will recognize familiar spells in these comics, such as healing and summoning magic, water walking, and petrification. As is often the case with mages, there are those who become corrupted with a hunger for more power, experimenting with dangerous and forbidden magics like immortality, resurrection, and transfiguration. Both parties also have rogues, fighters who use stealth, dexterity, and cunning to their advantage. Rogues pick locks, disarm traps, and use sleight of hand to aid the party. The architecture and equipment of these stories draws from historical periods, which is often the standard in fantasy media. In Meshi, the attire of Shuro Nakamoto's party pulls from Japan's past. Shuro wears armor similar to samurai gusoku and fights using a sword called a tachi. His party wears the robes and sandals commonly associated with shinobi and are experts with many weapons, including kunai. In Ozanari, there are organized groups like the Ninja Corps, who favor wearing the shinobi shozoku, the typical dark robes, hoods, and masks associated with ninja. The party also has allies like Azusa, a recurring character who leads a ninja clan. Other character designs borrow medieval elements from outside of Japan. The dwarf Senshi's horned helmet conjures feelings of ancient Vikings. Laos wears a more Western style of plate armor, resembling a knight of the Middle Ages. Beyond armor, both series include sentient magical swords. In Meshi, Laos befriends a living armor sword named Kensuke. It alerts Laos to danger, and according to the fan wiki, is based off of the D&D item Weapon of Warning. Kensuke literally translates to sword helper or sword boy, with suke being a common ending in Japanese names. This is mirrored with the introduction of Esprit, who appears as a sword and comes to the aid of the party during the early chapters of Ozanari. Esprit is a powerful being who chooses to observe and indirectly aid Mocha in an effort to see if there is good in the world. Esprit often knows the truth behind the events surrounding the dungeons, as well as the rising evils and powers of the realm. Esprit does their best not to directly affect the course of events, trusting in Mocha's judgment and abilities. Like Kensuke, Esprit occasionally warns the party of dangerous situations. Enchanted and living swords are a common trope in fantasy media, as well as in manga, with works like Soul Eater or Reincarnated as a Sword. Both series feature fearsome and formidable dragons. Dragons are a staple of fantasy media and give the creators another chance to show off their exceptional artistic abilities. Dragons are both adversaries as well as reminders of the vast wonders that can be found in fantasy realms. It just wouldn't be D&D without them. Another common point these stories share are organizations like clans and guilds. These groups offer rewards to adventurers for completing quests and bounties. The different factions influence world politics, pulling the strings and manipulating the course of events for their own means. The series also described long-standing historical rivalries between groups of royals and feuding nations. While both series are firmly rooted in the fantasy genre, they dabble with sci-fi elements. Despite their medieval environments, there are instances of advanced technology. The dwarves in Meshi use telephones, and there are glimpses of other newfangled innovations. Ozanari includes modern equipment like scuba suits and has a clear robotic influence from Koyama's time working on Gundam. Many character designs and suits of armor resemble the Great Mecha. These elements easily blend into fantasy worlds where anything can happen. New technologies mark the progress of society through the ages. Ruined tech can be useful to outline the world's history and highlight the skill and intelligence of the ancients. I often enjoy the combination of science fiction and fantasy. Novels like Anne McCaffrey's Dragonriders of Pern pull the best from both genres. Netflix has proven the two can be popular with its hit Stranger Things, filled with sci-fi mysteries and D&D fantasy. Hard sci-fi purists might argue fantasy has no place in sci-fi, favoring rigorous and realistic motifs. While it isn't really science fiction, I think Meshi's detailed and analytical approach to fantasy would please the purists. Isaac Asimov uses the phrase speculative fiction to broaden definitions of the science fiction genre. In a 1987 interview, Asimov hypothesized that, in the future, as long as we have a future, SF will broaden, become more dilute, and spread out until it overlaps all of fiction. I think all people who write fiction are going to have to take into account certain SF trends, especially that society is changing faster and faster. I tend to agree with those who suggest the two genres are one and the same, or use catch-all terms like science fantasy. After all, as Arthur C. Clarke said in his Third Law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The implications and consequences of innovation in a fantasy realm can make for exciting plot points, as harbingers of new tech clash against the old guard. Both comics start off in a more episodic fashion, before a dramatic plot starts to come together. I first heard about Dungeon Meshi in an early episode of the Manga-splaining podcast. They do a great job analyzing the series, and the book club-esque podcast is worth checking out. I pushed through the first few chapters of Meshi because of their recommendation, and the story really comes together as it goes on. While Ozanari always leans more towards Dungeon of the Week storytelling, it starts to pick up after the introduction of Esprit. As the party battles, the stakes of the world and the rival forces at work begin to unfold in the background. Both comics feature comedic elements and have a warm overall tone. They are a fun read, filled with new experiences, warm meals, and thrilling adventures. In Meshi, the need to eat monsters makes for humorous situations and reveals the characters' preferences. The dogfolk Killiman in Ozanari doesn't speak and communicates by holding signs and gesturing. This brings about a sort of Looney Tunes quality where Killiman resembles Wile E. Coyote. This allows for the signs to be punchlines as Killiman banters with the other characters. Ozanari's party occasionally breaks the fourth wall, referencing the readers or the pages of the volume. While they are mostly witty and playful stories, both series dip into darker themes. The characters in Meshi face fear, loss, and madness. Meshi delves into deep discussions of hunger and desire. The simple story of a party trying to eat is woven into a complex and epic yarn. While Ozanari is light for the most part, Mocha is a barbarian who gets her strength from rage. The evil in the world fuels her power, and the trio encounters many foes. Ozanari features nefarious villains who attempt to destroy entire cities and cultures. The usual comedic atmosphere contrasts the moments when the party faces real danger. Despite their fun-loving tone, these comics are grand-scale epics, and I think they will meet the expectations of fantasy readers. Another similarity is the influence of digital games. Koyama's career began in the 80s, alongside the rise of console games. Kui has a long list of video game inspirations like Divinity and Grimrock. In a 2024 Polygon article, Kui mentions watching her father play a 1990 DOS game called Wizardry 6, Bane of the Cosmic Forge. Remarkably, the same series Wizardry is cited to be an influence on Koyama, according to Ozanari's Japanese Wikipedia page. Wizardry is a first-person dungeon-crawling RPG, filled with diverse adventuring parties, exploring a monster-filled castle. The series clearly had quite the impact during its time, and a full 3D remake, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, was released on Steam earlier this year. There are further similarities in how the comics were created. Both mangaka are author and illustrator. The comics ran for a similar length. Ozanari's first series had 17 volumes, and Meshi finished with 14. Both stories are among the author's early works, and the creators grow even more skilled as they complete the series. The dungeons are a testing ground not only for the adventurous characters, but also the artists, as they whet their pen and hone their skills. The fantasy genre allows for a wealth of creative design. The vivid imagination and skill of the authors makes these comics an enjoyable read. The comics also include extra information and detailed world building. Ozanari has overworld maps between chapters, a staple of fantasy novels. At the start of volumes and chapters, there is extra art of the characters, including chibi designs and side stories like beach episodes. Dungeon Meshi includes additional information about the world with recipes and sketches of wildlife. Kui released several Daydream Hour art books. The books show off concept art, alternative fashion ideas, and further world building. Kui's extra sketches, maps, and details were collected and fleshed out into The Adventurer's Bible, released in 2022. The book shows off the lore of the series through character sheets and encyclopedic entries. Both series were adapted into animation. A telecom OVA titled Ozanari Dungeon Kaze no To, or Tower of the Wind, was released in 1991. Studio Trigger released a Meshi anime this year, which we'll talk about a little later. Now it's time to consider multiclassing as we look into what makes these stories unique. Part 3. The Differences. These manga were released decades apart, and there is a clear difference in art style. The world of Meshi is technically precise, with detailed characters, plants, and creatures. On the other hand, Ozanari is stylized with more of an 80s shonen feel, resembling comics like Dragon Ball or Saint Seiya. While Meshi is listed under tags like high fantasy or fantasy comedy, Ozanari is firmly in the sword and sorcery genre. The term sword and sorcery was coined in 1961 by Fritz Leiber, in part to differentiate the nuances of fantasy fiction. A 2020 article for Goodman Games describes the genre. The protagonists in sword and sorcery fiction are most often thieves, mercenaries, or barbarians, struggling not for worlds or kingdoms, but for their own gain or mere survival. They are rebels against authority, skeptical of civilization and its rulers and adherents. Unknown or hazardous lands are an essential ingredient of the genre, and if its protagonists should chance upon inhabited lands, they are often strangers to either the culture or civilization itself. Like most fantasy, sword and sorcery lends itself well to the comic medium, like Fritz Leiber's own Sword of Sorcery or Dark Horse's Xena. As I mentioned, Ozanari's Mocha resembles Xena, the warrior princess, and also She-Ra, the princess of power. She-Ra, like Mocha, fights evil with a magic sword. The 2018 Netflix reboot of She-Ra is one of my favorites and is well worth a watch. The 80s featured countless sword and sorcery classics like Thundercats or Galtar and the Golden Lance. With this influence, Ozanari is fast-paced and action-packed, whereas Meshi takes its time and slowly boils over. For Mocha and her friends, adventure is commonplace. While characters do occasionally eat or rest, they are protected by the veil of fantasy, and things usually just work out. In Meshi, discussing and rationing food helps bring the world to life. Considering food storage, preparation, and preservation is an everyday reality for dungeoneering adventurers. There are other differences in the settings of these stories. Despite them both involving dungeon diving, there are much more broad definitions of dungeons in Ozanari. The trio visits cities in the sky, as well as in the depths of the ocean. They cover a lot of ground as they swiftly move across the continent. Meshi takes place almost entirely in the same dungeon, known as the Island. The party journeys deeper through the maze of floors to less frequented and more dangerous areas. As the story goes on, the mysteries surrounding the dungeon and its creation begin to unfold. The adventuring parties have slight differences in composition. Ozanari's main party is a standard RPG trio composed of a fighter, mage, and rogue. They are often accompanied by side characters who help bolster their numbers. The party in Dungeon Meshi has twice as many mouths to feed. The guild includes Laus, a human fighter, Marcel, the half-elf mage, Chilchuk, a hobbit rogue, and Senshi, the dwarven cook, whose origin and real class are a mystery. They are later joined by Izutsumi, a catfolk ninja. Both series have magic academies, although they take different forms. In Meshi, Marcel and other mages study at a traditional magic college, a place where students can research and hone their abilities. The college is a realistic result of a world filled with magic users. In Ozanari, the Magic Academy is an ancient order of powerful robots, suspended high above the world. They draw conclusions and influence events while perfecting their own magic. It's possible this robotic academy once resembled Marcel's magic school. Over many centuries, the academy became powerful and secluded, losing touch with the rest of the world. The Magic Academy and other ancient robots show off Koyama's artistic skills, well practiced from their time drawing mecha for Gundam. As I mentioned, these comics dabble with sci-fi elements, but Ozanari is much more liberal with its use of robots and anything-goes settings and stories. There are flying ships, battle mechs, and Moro, a mad scientist obsessed with mechanical innovation. There is also the cowboy Ginger, who carries an electric guitar. While both manga have comedic elements, they each take a different approach. Meshi has genuine funny moments and its own style of humor brought about by the detailed world. Ozanari is more tongue-in-cheek and uses slapstick. Characters break the fourth wall and have many long-running gags. Besides the content of these comics, there is also a difference in the total body of works, in that Ozanari has many additional series. Koyama's combined canon of Ozanari is close to 40 volumes over 30 years. After Ozanari, Nariyuki Dungeon was released in 1997. It ran for 3 volumes. Nariyuki can be translated as outcome or result, and the story is a direct sequel to the events of the first series. In 2004, there was a prequel titled Naozari Dungeon, set years before when the trio first met. It had 8 volumes in total. Naozari can be translated as neglect, or making light of, and is also an anagram of Ozanari. Koyama created even more spin-off manga featuring the same party. The single-volume Dungeon Special looks into barbarian lore and Mocha's family. Another series, Dungeon Tactics, continues 3 years after Nariyuki and involves a great war. The latest Ozanari Dungeon volume, titled Cloud Pangea, was published in 2016. The trio journey to the ancient world of Pangea. The story involves parallel versions of Mocha adventuring on the new continent. Mocha discovers the mysteries of the land, as well as their lookalikes. Cloud Pangea was crowdfunded and exceeded its goal by almost 1 million yen, proving the series' lasting popularity. Koyama shared some words of thanks after meeting the funding goal. Although I have tried to depict the same adventure story over a long period of time, the series has had to be interrupted many times as the magazine itself has reached the end of its life cycle. No matter how many times I ask myself, can I still draw? Or do I want to continue? The answer is always, I still want to draw. I don't know if it's the right answer, but I thought crowdfunding would be a good way to show my willingness to continue and to ask a broad question, so I started this project. It seems Koyama can't help but draw, and that's lucky for all of us readers. Ozanari is a fun and exciting adventure series with dozens of volumes to enjoy. Another layer of the onion is that Dungeon Meshi was released after the more recent boom of isekai manga. Isekai means other world, and being transported to another world has long been a theme in popular novels like the Chronicles of Narnia or Alice in Wonderland. Around 2010, isekai manga started to spike in popularity, and the genre has since become saturated. Isekai stories often borrow from RPG and D&D themes, taking inspiration from ideas like experience, skills, and level-ups. These stories commonly feature guilds and adventuring parties, as well as magic and dungeons. Just reading the titles of a few comics, it is easy to see how popular the dungeon genre has become. There are titles like Dungeon Reset, Dungeon People, and who could forget, reborn as a vending machine, I Now Wander the Dungeon. While Dungeon Meshi is itself not an isekai, it was released just a few years after the boom, to an audience that was familiar and eager for D&D themes. Meshi's unique take and realistic world was a welcome break from the usual isekai power fantasy. Decades earlier, isekai and D&D themes were already being combined. In 1983, Marvel Productions and Toei Animation produced a series titled Dungeons & Dragons. The animated show saw a party of displaced teenagers with a familiar class lineup of a mage, rogue, and barbarian, among others. Another consideration is the ongoing development and influence of digital games. As video games continue to become more advanced, they are better able to represent the imaginary worlds of tabletop RPGs. As I mentioned, Koei has said they were directly inspired by a long list of video games like Grimrock and Baldur's Gate. The rise of video games and digital D&D helped to capture new fans. RPG games are now more popular than ever, with Larian Studios' Baldur's Gate 3 winning a slew of awards in the past 2 years, including Game of the Year and Best Storytelling. Ozanari was first released in the late 80s, just a decade after D&D officially hit the market. Digital RPG games were starting to blossom, and the decade saw the rise of classics like Rogue, Gauntlet, and Dungeon Master. Ozanari at one point had a Super Nintendo game in the works, although it was ultimately cancelled. It would have been fun to see the RPG and dungeon elements turned back into a playable game. Meshi has a board game adaptation titled Monster Eater, released in 2022, completing the cycle back to tabletop games. Players each take control of a party from the comic and explore a labyrinth using cards and dice. As with our last Versus episode, there is a difference in localization. Meshi is a hit in many languages. Netflix has dubs in at least 10 languages, including English, Spanish, and Arabic. As far as I can see, Ozanari has not had an English print run for the manga. The manga and OVA were released in Japanese and Portuguese, which shows that the series had at least some global appeal even back in the early 90s. This leads to a difference in critical reception and scale of sales. Ozanari is estimated by Manga Codex to have sold 1.2 million copies. This is an impressive amount, placing it in good company alongside other popular works like Pumpkin Scissors and Witch Watch. Including the other series in the Ozanari canon, the total sales are even higher. Despite being released much later, Dungeon Meshi has already sold upwards of 14 million copies and has regularly placed on the best-selling Oricon charts. Meshi has also won several awards. It was Da Vinci's 13th Best Comic in 2015 and won the Seiya Awards Best Comic in 2024. It is rising in popularity due to its anime adaptation by Studio Trigger. In the 2024 Anime Corner Awards, Meshi was named both Best Adventure and Best Comedy. Studio Trigger is well known for anime such as Kill la Kill and Little Witch Academia. As is often the case in these Versus episodes, the existence of a full anime adaptation brings a rising tide. Voice actors and animators bring the characters to life, showing off their quirks with a range of motion. Anime opening and ending songs propel both the series and the bands forward to new fans. Adaptations also provide a chance to address any pacing problems or highlight specific aspects of the story. With the success of the anime and Kui working closely with the studio, I'm excited to see what they do next. In the future, Kui's career might end up mirroring Koyama's vast body of works. Other stories in the Meshi universe would be fun, but anything Kui makes will surely uphold their high levels of detail and creativity. As for Ozanari, it would be fun to see it adapted again. With the recent reboot of Ranma 1/2 by MAPPA, it seems there is still a market for 1980s series in today's world of streaming services. Despite their differences, both comics are delightful depictions of dungeon diving. Thanks for watching this far into the video. I hope we've delved deep enough into these comics to highlight why they are popular and why I enjoyed reading them. If you like one of these manga, you'll probably like the other, and Ozanari has plenty of volumes to catch up on. If you have suggestions for comics for the next Versus episode, please leave me a comment below, and let me know if you're the barbarian, mage, or the rogue of your party. Like the video if you like D&D, and subscribe if you want to see more videos. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.